There is a particular quality to silence in the void of space that no mortal language has ever sufficiently captured. It is not the silence of an empty room, nor the silence of a held breath before battle. It is something older, something that existed before the first star ignited, and will persist long after the last ember of creation cools to black. I have known that silence intimately for longer than most sentient minds are capable of comprehending. I have lain suspended inside it, cradled within dormancy, breathing one shallow breath for every decade that passed in the galaxy beyond my stasis casket. I have felt it the way the dead feel the earth above their graves, as weight, as pressure, as the absolute and patient indifference of a universe that does not mourn the things it consumes. My name is Malchin Vane. I hold the rank of Shield Captain of the Legio Custodes, and I have served the Emperor of Mankind since before the Horus heresy calcified the wounds of the Imperium into permanent scar tissue. I am telling you this not to establish authority. Authority, in my experience, is the province of the living, and I have spent more centuries removed from that particular condition than I care to calculate, but to establish context. What I witnessed aboard the Unbroken Covenant, the space hulk the Tau of the Kelshon September designated the vessel of potential wisdom, required someone capable of perceiving its full horror. Someone old enough to understand what those corridors truly contained. Someone who had seen what slept within them, because I was among those things. Understand what a space hulk is. Not the clinical definition rendered in some administratum catalog of navigational hazards. Understand it the way sailors of ancient Terran seas once understood the deep ocean, not as geography, but as a living accumulation of catastrophe. A space hulk is not a single vessel. It is a centuries-long collision of misfortune, a gravitational marriage of wrecked freighters, derelict warships, shattered orbital platforms, and the occasional Xenos construction that drifted into the fused mass over the long centuries of its wandering. They move through the immaterium and re-enter real space unpredictably, carrying with them everything that was aboard each component vessel at the moment of each catastrophe. They are archaeology made dimensional. They are the sedimentary layers of history compressed into corridors of iron and silence. The Unbroken Covenant had been accumulating its dead for 3,000 years before the Tau found it. I do not know the precise moment I began to regain awareness. Dormancy does not release its hold cleanly. It unravels slowly, reluctantly, the way an old wound refuses to close without pulling at the surrounding flesh. There are layers to the withdrawal, first a dim recognition that sensation still exists, then the gradual return of proprioception, then sound filtering through the casket's walls and fragments, then finally, over the course of what my internal chrono estimated as 11 hours, the coherent return of conscious thought. I was not alarmed by what I found when awareness fully crystallized. I had expected something of this nature. The Covenant's passive detection arrays, the one slave to emergency protocols deep within its tertiary mechanical nervous system, had registered the approach of multiple vessels. Not vessels of the Imperium. The mass shadow profiles were wrong, too elegant, too precisely engineered, the thrust signatures too clean. Whatever was approaching had been built by a civilization that had not yet learned that elegance was a luxury the galaxy could not indefinitely sustain. I knew what they were before any visual confirmation became available. I had read the intelligence assessments compiled during the latter centuries of M41. I had studied the reports from the Taros campaign, the Damocles Crusade, the countless frontier engagements where the Imperium had bled against a species that chose to fight from distance, that chose diplomacy and strategy over the blunt instrument of close engagement, that believed, with a sincerity I found at once admirable and catastrophically naive, that the galaxy could be made rational, that sapient beings could be organized into something coherent, cooperative, and ultimately sustainable if only the right framework were applied. The Tau, the children of the greater good. I remember, even in those early moments of waking, feeling something I could only characterize as sorrow. Not contempt. I had long since burned contempt away as an unproductive luxury, but the particular sorrow of foreknowledge, of watching a creature approach a hazard it cannot perceive because it has never encountered anything like it before. The Tau were extraordinary beings in many respects. Their capacity for interspecies coordination, their willingness to incorporate other species into their seps without the dehumanizing apparatus of conquest, their philosophical sophistication regarding collective purpose. These were not insignificant achievements. In a galaxy that produced almost nothing but suffering, the Tau had managed, against improbable odds, to produce something that functioned. None of that mattered within a space hulk. None of their fire-cast marksmanship, none of their crisis battlesuit fire support, none of their command discipline or fire warrior tactical doctrines or the precise calculated efficiency of their breacher teams meant anything in corridors that narrowed to the width of a single Terminator's pauldrons. The Tau were a species whose military doctrine had been perfected around one fundamental concept: distance. Stand back, coordinate, suppress, direct superior firepower from advantageous range. It was elegant. It was disciplined. It was precisely the doctrine that would kill them all inside this vessel. I had no way to warn them. Even if I had, I found myself uncertain whether I would have. Not from cruelty. Understand that. What I felt in those early waking moments was not cruelty. Not the pleasure of anticipated slaughter. It was something quieter and more complicated, the recognition that some lessons cannot be transmitted. They can only be experienced. And the unbroken covenant was very, very old at the business of teaching. The first sounds of their breach teams cutting through the outer hull reached me just before dawn of the second day. I lay still in the dark and listened, and the ship, slowly, began to wake with me. Let me tell you what the unbroken covenant was, before I tell you what it became. In the 36th millennium, during the period scholars now designate the Age of Apostasy, a strike cruiser of the Black Templars chapter, the Righteous Covenant, was engaged in a purge operation in the Styx Nebula. The specifics of that campaign no longer matter to anyone living. What matters is that the vessel was grievously damaged in the engagement's final hours, its Geller field generators wrecked beyond emergency repair, and the crew faced a choice that all who sail the Imperium eventually confront: attempt warp translation under inadequate protection, or remain in real space and die more slowly. They chose the warp. The warp chose something else for them entirely. The Righteous Covenant emerged 200 years later, fused to the hull of a dead Mechanicus explorator vessel, the Ordo Machini designation Tertia Sigma 11. No living crew remained aboard the Covenant. The nature of what had been done to those brothers I will not describe in detail, except to say that the warp does not simply kill those who travel through it without proper shelter. It transforms them. It invests its own character into the residual matter of what it has consumed. The corridors of the Righteous Covenant, when the first salvage teams from Forge World Avacor eventually boarded, were not merely corridors. They were something that had been corridors once and had since been renegotiated by forces that do not respect the distinction between architecture and biology. Over the following centuries, the conjoined mass accumulated. A decommissioned Chartist vessel, the Godemperor's Plenitude, impacted against the growing hulk in M37. 2 decades later, the outer structure absorbed the shattered remnants of an Orc cruiser destroyed during a minor naval engagement near the Ghoul Stars. Eldar wreck components of indeterminate age were noted in later surveys, ghost arc fragments or perhaps components of something older, pre-fall, from an era no living member of any current species had witnessed firsthand. Each edition brought its own history. Each edition brought its own dead. And each edition brought its own particular species of dormant malice, folded into bulkheads and locked within sealed compartments and held in stasis within sarcophagi that the salvage teams either did not find or were wise enough to leave unopened. I was added to the Covenant in M41, 200 years before the Tau arrival. The circumstances that brought me there are relevant to understand, even if they are not the story I am telling now. A custodian does not come to rest within a space hulk by accident. We do not drift. We do not fall. I was placed here deliberately, in a stasis casket of the Emperor's own design, within a vault sealed beneath the former lower decks of the Righteous Covenant, in the section the later salvagers had named the Iron Sepulchre. I was placed here because someone, some authority above even the custodian hierarchy that I have always served, determined that what was aboard this hulk required a guardian. Someone who could endure indefinite preservation without the psychological degradation that afflicts unaugmented minds in long dormancy. Someone capable of waking, of assessing, of responding with lethal decisiveness if the sealed chambers of the lower decks were ever disturbed. I did not agree with the decision. I want that stated clearly. I have never made a habit of voicing objection to orders emanating from authorities I recognize as legitimate, but I am also not an instrument without interiority. I am not a weapon without a perspective of its own. I was a shield captain who had served since before the walls of the palace were besieged, and being sealed within a drifting necropolis struck me as an assignment that bordered on burial rather than deployment. I made my objection known through the appropriate channels. My objection was noted, considered, and overruled. So I slept, and I came to understand, over the years of dormancy, why I had been chosen. A space hulk is not merely a navigational hazard or a source of salvageable material. In the correct circumstances, under the attention of the correct minds, it is a weapon. The Covenant was a weapon. The things preserved within its sealed vaults, the things I had been placed here to guard against external interference with, were weapons of a very specific and very ancient kind. Kill automata of mechanicus provenance, their machine spirits driven to perpetual hostility by centuries of warp immersion. Terminator veterans of the Black Templars whose genetically accelerated physiology had not perished in the Righteous Covenant's warp translation but had instead been metabolically suspended by the same energies that had reshaped everything else aboard the vessel. They were not alive in any conventional sense. But they were not dead either. They occupied a third state that the Imperium's Medicae lexicons have never adequately defined: preserved, reactive, waiting, triggered by sufficient biomass approaching within defined proximity parameters, triggered by atmospheric pressure changes indicative of hull breach, triggered by the electromagnetic signature of non-imperial weapons fire within the vessel's interior, triggered, in other words, by exactly the kind of boarding action the Tau were currently undertaking. I could hear them now more clearly as my audiometric implants completed their recalibration. Cutting torches, magnetic anchor bolts fired into hull plating, the hiss of equalizing atmospheric pressure as breach teams established corridor access. Voices, small and precise, carrying the particular cadence of Tau Shas communication. Clipped, coordinated, without the weight of Astartes' brevity or the florid formality of administratum discourse. Purposeful, optimistic even, the voices of individuals who believed they were walking into something that could be mapped, catalogued, and ultimately understood. They were not wrong to believe that. Understanding was entirely possible here. The Covenant would ensure they understood everything before the end. I rose from the casket and stood in the dark of the iron sepulchre, listening to the distant sounds of their entry. 41 hours of accelerated post-dormancy metabolic cycling before I would be capable of full combat effectiveness. 41 hours in which the vessel would have to conduct its own introductions. I considered what I knew of the Tau's greater good philosophy as I waited in the dark. I found, to my surprise, that I hoped some of them would be wise enough to run. The Tau designated their mission expedition Aunkais, a term from the Tau lexicon that translates most closely as the opening of a sealed understanding. It was a characteristically optimistic designation. They had been tracking the Covenant's reemergence into real space for 16 standard months, monitoring its drift pattern from sensor outposts along the outer rim of Kelshan September territory, calculating its likely trajectory with the kind of computational precision that Tau Earthcast researchers brought to every problem they found sufficiently interesting. And they had found it interesting indeed. A vessel of that mass tonnage, reemerging from warp with residual energies consistent with multiple Archaeotech components, represented what their intelligence assessors termed a Category 3 potential acquisition, significant enough to dispatch a formal exploration mission, not significant enough to warrant a full military escort. That assessment would be revised before the expedition concluded. The boarding force they committed was, by Tau standards, substantial for an exploration operation. 2 full teams of Shaslaw Fire warriors in breacher configuration, 12 soldiers per team, equipped with the formidable pulse blasters that the Firecast favored for close-quarters work, supplemented by a smaller element of Pathfinders operating in their advanced reconnaissance capacity. Behind them came the Earthcast contingent that represented the expedition's actual purpose. 6 technical analysts under the direction of VRE Chausoras, a Watercast diplomat attached to the mission to assess any potential diplomatic angles, and the expedition commander himself, Shaso Vashel Kai, a Firecast veteran of 18 campaigns who had survived the Taro's withdrawal and earned his O-rank decorations in blood. I observed all of this through the passive sensory network embedded within the Covenant's walls, a system I had gradually reacquired access to as my dormancy receded, re-establishing connection with the vessel's tertiary nerve weave through the data tethers installed in the Iron Sepulchre. The network was not sophisticated by contemporary Mechanica standards. It had been designed for monitoring, not interaction, a dead man's eye rather than an operational surveillance apparatus. But it was sufficient. I could see their entry point in the portside loading bay. I could track their formation as they moved through the first corridors. I could observe the careful, methodical way Shaso Kai organized his force. Pathfinders extended ahead to scan, fire warriors in paired columns, Earth-caste personnel in the protected interior of the formation, the diplomat Paraviari moving with the distinctive unhurried composure of a water-caste member who had learned to trust the surrounding military to manage the immediate dangers. They were doing everything correctly. By every tactical doctrine that applied to boarding operations, in any universe where their tactical doctrine had any bearing on what they were boarding, they were conducting an exemplary operation. Entry through a structural compromise point rather than a defended access corridor. Formation discipline maintained from the first moment. Point elements using their marker lights to tag environmental features for the benefit of the main body. Communication relays being established at regular intervals to maintain contact with their parent vessels, hovering at a safe distance from the Covenant's mass. Even the psychologically difficult business of moving through the truly alien interior of an ancient space hulk, the buckled corridors, the non-Euclidean spatial anomalies caused by centuries of warp contact, the walls that seemed to breathe and the ceilings that receded into darkness so absolute it felt like staring into a different dimension. Even all of that they managed with reasonable professional composure. The Covenant's first section was relatively benign. It always was. The outer layers of a space hulk, the most recently accreted components, tend to be the most structurally coherent and the least saturated with whatever particular variety of malign residue the older layers have accumulated over centuries of Imperium exposure. The loading bay through which the Tau had entered was part of a Chartist merchant vessel, the Godemperor's Plenitude component, accreted in M37. The merchant section still contained identifiable artifacts of its former purpose. Cargo canisters welded permanently to the floor by some force that had long since ceased to be active, the remnants of a loading servitor arm extending from one wall like a frozen prayer, the faded iconography of the Godemperor's Imperial Aquila stenciled above a door that no longer opened. The Tau moved through all of this with the analytical attention of scholars encountering primary sources. I watched Vricha Soares, the lead Earth-caste researcher, move to the Aquila stenciling and study it. Her portable analytical unit was already extended, sampling the atmospheric chemistry of the room, assaying trace mineral deposits on the floor, recording visual data for later analysis. She spoke to the Pathfinder team leader in the measured, quietly fascinated tones of someone who had waited 16 months to be standing exactly here. I could not hear the precise content of her communication. My passive network was optimized for proximity detection rather than audio reproduction, but her body language was unmistakable. She was delighted. She was standing inside what she believed to be the greatest archaeological opportunity her caste had encountered in a generation, and the adrenaline equivalent of Tau neurochemistry was clearly operational in full. I understood her. I wish I had not. Understanding requires empathy, and empathy, in circumstances like these, is not a comfortable faculty. They proceeded deeper on the second hour. The merchant section gave way to a transitional corridor, one of those structural compression points where two component vessels of the hulk had fused, the bulkheads of each interleaving with the other in patterns that the geometry of a sane universe would not permit. The corridor narrowed here. The ceiling dropped. The Tau formation, previously maintaining a comfortable four-abreast spread, was forced to compress into pairs, then into single file in the tightest section. Shaso Kai ordered a pause at the compression point. I watched him study the sensors. I watched the Pathfinder team leader transmit something back to the parent vessel. I watched the diplomat Paraviari press her smaller frame against the wall to allow a fire warrior to move past her, and I noticed, with the particular attention of someone who had studied thousands of individual beings' responses to stress, that she was looking at the walls. Not studying them. Looking at them. The way living things look at other living things that they suspect might be watching. She was perceptive for a non-military caste. I noted it and I kept watching. The deeper a boarding party descends into a space hulk, the more the vessel's character reveals itself. This is not a metaphor. It is not aesthetic observation. It is operational reality, documented in every Deathwatch briefing on space Hulk incursion protocols, referenced in rogue trader logs dating back to the early centuries of the Imperium, acknowledged even in fragmentary Mechanicus data psalms recovered from aborted salvage operations across 3 millennia of attempted exploitation. A space Hulk is not static. It is not a simple dead object. Its inner layers are saturated with residual warp imprinting, with the concentrated psychic impression of centuries of catastrophe absorbed into every metal surface, and that saturation has effects that are not easily categorized as either mechanical or metaphysical. The lights change in the deeper sections. Not merely dim, they had been dim since the first corridor, but shift in spectrum, moving into frequencies that the human retina processes as slightly wrong, as subtly misaligned with reality in a way that induces unease before the conscious mind has identified why. Temperature gradients appear without rational source. Gravity becomes inconsistent in localized pockets, points where items placed on the floor drift imperceptibly upward over periods of hours, where condensation on the walls runs in directions that angles cannot account for. Sound behaves abnormally. Sounds originating in distant sections of the vessel carry with anomalous clarity, while sounds generated in the immediate vicinity are partially absorbed, as if the air itself has developed selective acoustic properties. The Tau, to their professional credit, cataloged all of this rather than being paralyzed by it. I watched VRE Chasoras and her team working with methodical diligence, tagging spatial anomalies with marker indicators, recording atmospheric readings, entering data streams into portable cogitators with the disciplined efficiency of scientists confronting a genuinely novel environment. They had encountered warp phenomena before at the periphery. They had records from their interactions with other species, the limited exchanges with inquisitorial representatives in the ceasefire periods, the captured data on psychic phenomena from their engagements with Grey Knight's elements. They understood, in theoretical terms, that the Imperium produced tangible effects on real space matter over extended contact periods. Understanding in theoretical terms and experiencing it directly in a narrow corridor 300 meters beneath the outer hull of a vessel that had been accumulating warp saturation for 3 millennia are very different cognitive categories. It was during the 4th hour that the first anomaly they could not catalog rationally made itself apparent. The Pathfinder team, operating approximately 40 meters ahead of the main body, had penetrated into a section I recognized from my dormancy era sensory mapping as the Tertius Sigma 11 component, the Mechanicus Explorator vessel that had been the second major accretion of the Covenant's growing mass. The Explorator vessel's corridors were recognizably different in character from the merchant section they had departed. Mechanicus vessels are built around function expressed as devotion, every structural element a component in an act of worship toward the Omnia, every corridor width and ceiling height the product of calculations that mixed engineering necessity with theological numerology. The Tertius Sigma 11 corridors had 6-sided cross-sections. The walls bore the recessed contours of equipment bays that had been emptied of their contents at some point before the vessel's loss. Emptied deliberately, the bays sealed rather than simply stripped, as if someone had removed the equipment they contained with enough advance warning to be methodical about it. The Pathfinder team leader, VRE Kais, stopped in the first of these corridors. I watched her extend her hand toward the nearest sealed equipment bay. I watched the 2 nearest Pathfinders raise their weapons instinctively in response to their team leader's posture before she spoke something that visibly stood them down. She then ran her hand along the seal of the bay's locking mechanism. The mechanism was sealed from the inside. Something in the way she communicated this to Shasokai told me she understood the implication. Things sealed from the inside cannot have been locked by personnel evacuating the space. Things sealed from the inside imply that whatever was inside them chose, at some point, to seal itself in. Machines do not do that. Machines do not make decisions about their own containment. Whatever was in those equipment bays had at some prior moment been capable of self-directed action. Shasokai's response was measured. He ordered the pace slowed. He ordered additional marker light coverage of the corridor ahead. He did not order withdrawal, not yet, because 16 months of mission preparation had generated too much institutional momentum for a sealed door to overcome it, and because the information they had already gathered was extraordinary enough to justify continued risk assessment. He was being responsible. He was being professional. He was, within his own doctrinal framework, making the correct call. He did not know, because he could not have known, that the equipment bays were not what warranted his attention. What warranted his attention was 20 meters beneath his feet. The kilautomata of the Covenant's deepest level, the ones I had been placed here to prevent unauthorized access to, and which I was now forbidden from activating or directing by the same sealed orders that had placed me in stasis, had been registering the electromagnetic signature of Tau weaponry for 4 hours. Their machine spirits were ancient and specific in their classification protocols, but they were not complex enough to distinguish between hostile and non-hostile presences. The Tau Fire Warriors' pulse blasters registered as weapons. The Pathfinder's carbines registered as weapons. The technical analyst's portable equipment registered as nothing. The automata were not calibrated to recognize it, but there were sufficient weapon signatures to achieve the threshold. The kilautomata had begun their wake cycle at hour 3. At the precise moment VRE-Kais touched the sealed equipment bay lock, they completed it. The sound that reached the Pathfinders first was not mechanical. It was not the servo whir of actuating limbs or the pneumatic pressure release of hydraulic systems. It was something between a tone and a vibration, felt in the chest before it was heard by the ears, a frequency so low it existed at the threshold between sound and physical force. The floor beneath the Tau expedition transmitted it upward through the soles of their boots and into their skeletal structures like the preliminary harmonic of something vast tuning itself for performance. VRE-Kais lowered her hand from the bay seal very slowly. I noted, with what I will acknowledge was a form of sorrowful professional respect, that she recognized exactly what she was feeling. She issued the withdrawal order before Shasokai did. There is a particular kind of intelligence that a machine develops over sufficient time in proximity to the warp. Not the intelligence of reason or calculation or the directed processing of a cogitator. Something different and, in its way, more dangerous, a pattern recognition capacity that the Omnisia's priests can neither fully explain nor reliably replicate, a form of awareness that has no biological substrate and no consciousness in the philosophical sense of the term, yet behaves in ways that suggest consciousness to any observer with the capacity for honest assessment. The Covenant had it. After 3,000 years, it had it thoroughly. I want to be precise about what this means, because imprecision here would misrepresent what I witnessed. The vessel did not think in any way I would characterize as equivalent to thought. It did not formulate intentions or experience desires. It did not perceive the Tau expedition as prey or as threat or as anything that would imply the representational cognitive architecture of a mind. What it did, what centuries of warp imprinting had created within its mechanical nervous system, was a form of reactive resonance. The electromagnetic signatures of the Tau weapons, the biomass signatures of 43 living beings moving through its corridors, the pressure and atmospheric changes of their passage. All of these stimulated the vessel's deep systems the way light stimulates the proteins in a human retina. Not thought, response, not intention, reflex, but the reflexes of a vessel that had been trained by 3,000 years of intermittent warp contact were reflexes of extraordinary sophistication. The first thing the Covenant did, not commanded, not chose, but did, the way a sleeping animal does not choose to twitch at sudden sound, was seal the transitional corridors. It was subtle at first. Blast doors, long dormant, cycling through their lock mechanisms a millimeter at a time rather than slamming shut with the obvious finality that would have triggered immediate panic. Atmospheric regulators adjusted in patterns that increased the density of gas in the outer corridors by a fraction of a percent per 20-minute cycle. Not enough to register as dangerous on the Tau monitoring equipment, but sufficient over hours to increase respiratory effort and thereby increase fatigue at a rate that would compound decisively over a sustained operation. Lighting systems in the sections ahead of the expedition's current position, sections they had not yet entered, shifted their spectra toward frequencies my diagnostics identified as psychically suggestive, a residual effect of the warp imprinting acting on the vessel's primitive optical systems, generating light in wavelengths that interacted poorly with the neurochemistry of beings unfamiliar with the Covenant's particular brand of immaterial corruption. The Tau noticed. Of course they noticed. They were not undisciplined. They were not fools. The Pathfinder team had doubled back toward the main body at VRE-Kais's withdrawal order, and the formation had begun its measured retrograde, maintaining spacing, maintaining observation discipline, moving toward the transitional corridor that led back to the merchant section and ultimately to their entry point. Professional. Controlled. showing the kind of cohesion under unexpected stress that only comes from extensive training and genuine institutional confidence. The first blast door they encountered in the process of that retrograde was one they had passed through on their inward journey. At that time, for hours prior, it had been held open by a mechanical failure of its track mechanism. Visible rust and accumulated debris preventing the door from fully closing on its groove. When the Pathfinder Advance element reached it during withdrawal, it was closed. The mechanical failure had not been repaired. The debris was gone. The rust remained on the floor below the track, but the door was sealed, and when Shasokai ordered his engineering element forward to assess the closure mechanism, Viarichasora spent 3 minutes studying the track and then communicated something to the commander that I could tell from his posture he had already concluded for himself. The debris had not been removed. It had been compressed into the wall joint. The door mechanism had not been repaired. It had simply closed with sufficient force to overcome the obstruction, embedding the debris in the wall rather than clearing it. There are documented mechanical forces capable of producing that result. None of them are commonly associated with independently operating blast doors on abandoned vessels. Shasokai ordered the engineering element to begin cutting through the door. He did not divert any of the fire warrior element to assist. He was maintaining his combat perimeter, the pulse blasters covering their flanks and rear with the calm attentiveness of soldiers who had not yet processed their situation as emergency level, who were still operating in elevated alert mode rather than combat mode. This was the right call. He had no way to know how long this distinction would be sustainable. The cutting operation began. It would take, by my estimate of the equipment and material involved, approximately 25 minutes to breach the door. 25 minutes during which the expedition was stationary, compressed into a corridor that allowed limited freedom of movement, in a section of the vessel that was actively configuring itself around them. I had completed 31 hours of my post-dormancy metabolic cycling. I had 10 hours remaining before full combat effectiveness. I spent those hours watching and calculating, and forming the particular kind of opinion that one forms when one witnesses something terrible approaching and possesses no capacity to intervene. The kill automata were awake. I could feel their actuator systems through the floor, not physical vibration, but the electromagnetic resonance of power cells reaching operational charge, of processing units cycling through activation protocols that had last been executed 3 centuries before. They were not sophisticated entities. They had not been designed for sophistication. They had been designed for one purpose executed with maximum mechanical commitment, and that purpose was the elimination of non-imperial life signs within their patrol parameters. They did not know the Tau were trying to leave. They did not have the cognitive architecture to register the distinction between an enemy advancing and an enemy retreating. The Tau were non-imperial. The Tau were present. The two facts together constituted, for the automata, a complete operational mandate. 24 minutes remained on the cutting operation. The first automaton had been moving through the subfloor conduits for 19 minutes. It was approximately 12 meters below the rearmost element of the Tau formation when the cutting operation was completed. The blast door came open in a cascade of sparks and the shriek of shearing metal, falling inward toward the merchant section with a boom that resonated through the entire accessible structure of the Covenant. I felt it through my feet in the iron sepulchre. A pressure wave conducted through 300 meters of ancient iron and fused hull plating, arriving at my position as a faint but unmistakable percussion. The sound would have carried through every corridor of the vessel's inhabited sections. It would have been heard by every mechanical system in the Covenant capable of processing acoustic input. It was heard by the things in the walls. The Tau formation moved through the open door with admirable discipline given the speed of their passage. Shasokai had organized a leapfrog withdrawal, half the force moving through while the other half held covering positions, then a reversal, the second half withdrawing through the gap while the first half established new covering lines beyond it. The Pathfinders moved last, their enhanced optics extended backward into the corridor they were vacating, scanning with the taut focus of soldiers who had decided, at the experiential level below conscious deliberation, that the situation had crossed from unusual into dangerous. The last Pathfinder through the door was a young soldier whose designation I could not read from my passive network. What I could read was the posture, the set of shoulders and angle of the weapon and the particular speed of the crossing, just slightly faster than the professional pace Shasokai had established. the body's honest communication, outpacing the mind's training. This soldier had felt something at the rear of the formation. Not heard, not seen. Felt. The fine hair instinct of a living being whose nervous system is considerably more sensitive than its rational faculties would prefer to acknowledge, detecting the precise subvibrational quality that moves through metal floors when something large is moving beneath them. The blast door was sealed behind the last Pathfinder by the expedition's engineering element, welded shut rather than merely closed, in a decision that reflected Shasokai's operational intelligence while simultaneously demonstrating how completely he had misread the nature of the threat. Sealing a door against things that move through floors is comfort, not containment. They made it to the merchant section's outer corridors before the first automaton surfaced. It came up through the floor of the transitional corridor, the same compression point they had navigated on their inward passage, erupting through the deck plating in a manner that implied the floor had not been a barrier worth acknowledging. I know the design of these automata intimately, having spent centuries in dormant proximity to them. They are not elegant. They were built in the latter period of the Mechanicus's engagement with the Covenant's assembly, constructed to function within the vessel's geometry without requiring the vessel's structural integrity as a boundary of their operation. They move through maintenance conduits, through service channels, through spaces between bulkheads that were designed for power cabling and atmospheric ducting, spaces so narrow that no biological entity larger than a juvenile could access them. When the automaton reached the transitional corridor from beneath, it did not breach the floor through force. It disassembled a section of deck plating from below with the methodical efficiency of a machine following a function protocol, removed 4 deck plates in a sequence optimized to minimize load-bearing disruption to the surrounding structure, and then rose through the resulting aperture. The fire warriors at the rear of the formation turned when the deck plates began their removal sequence. The sound was recognizable metal separation, the particular percussion of bolts extracted from mounting points, the progressive signature of engineered disassembly rather than accidental collapse. They turned, and they raised their weapons, and they had their pulse blasters oriented on the aperture before the automaton had fully emerged. Their reaction time was, by any reasonable military standard, exceptional. It did not matter. The automaton was not large by the standard of war machines the Imperium fields in conventional engagements. It was not a dreadnought, not a sentinel, not a Lehman Russ chassis or anything comparable to the categories of armored warfare that defined most military engagement scales. It was approximately 2.5 meters in height, bilaterally symmetrical, constructed around a reinforced central chassis with 4 limbs, 2 configured for locomotion, 2 for engagement, and a sensor cluster at the apex that functioned as its primary perception apparatus. It was built entirely from the dense iron alloys favored by the Mechanicus in the 33rd millennium, before the refinements in ceramite integration that later designs incorporated, and it wore that density the way old things wear age, not with elegance, but with the particular invulnerability of things whose mass alone constitutes a defensive property. The pulse blasters fired. I watched the discharge signature, 4 weapons in near-simultaneous sequence, the characteristic blue-white bloom of compressed particle projection at close range, the weapons configurations that the fire cast specifically developed for hull breaching and compartment clearing operations. The automaton was slowed. The projectile impacts registered as physical perturbations to its forward momentum, the energy transfer measurable, the structural effect real. I could see the surface cratering on its chassis even through the passive network's limited resolution. But the chassis was 300 millimeters of ancient Mechanicus iron at its thickest points, and the automaton's machine spirit assessed the damage with the equanimity of a system whose damage threshold protocols had been calibrated against much heavier fire than it was currently receiving, and it continued its emergence from the floor aperture, and it reached the leading fire warrior before the second firing sequence could complete. The leading fire warrior was a large specimen by Tau standards. The automaton's engagement limb removed him from the formation's flank with a mechanical precision that bore no relationship to anything I could characterize as malice or aggression. It was simply physics. Mechanical force applied to a biological target. The scream that followed was the first sound of the expedition's true education. Shasokai's response was immediate. He did not freeze. He did not panic. He directed covering fire, issued the formation withdrawal to combat pace, and placed himself between the automaton and the non-combat elements of his party in a sequence of actions that required less than 4 seconds from initiation to completion. He was, I will say without reservation, an impressive military commander doing everything that could be done in a situation for which his entire doctrine had not prepared him. 6 fire warriors maintained covering fire while the formation withdrew. The automaton processed 9 pulse blaster impacts in the time it took to close the distance to the covering element. And beneath the floor, the second automaton was already disassembling its access point. And in the sealed compartments of the Righteous Covenant component 300 meters away, something far older than the automata was completing a different kind of awakening. I should explain what the Terminator veterans of the Righteous Covenant are, because if you approach this with the assumption that they are simply large armored soldiers waiting to fight, you will fail to understand what the Tau expedition encountered, and that failure of understanding would be a disservice to the horror of it. The Black Templars are not like other Space Marine chapters in their relationship with combat. They are not merely warriors. They are pilgrims of war, theologians of violence, beings who have invested the act of battle with a spiritual dimension that the more austere chapters tend to regard with doctrinal suspicion. The Eternal Crusade is not, for a Black Templar, a mission statement. It is a cosmological position, the belief that battle against the Emperor's enemies is itself an act of worship, that every enemy slain is a devotional act, that the only failure a Black Templar can commit is not fighting when fighting is possible. This is not metaphor. This is not institutional rhetoric. For the brothers of the Righteous Covenant, who had been fighting continuously for 70 years before their warp translation, whose chapter had not stood down from active engagement in 10,000 years, whose entire psychological architecture had been built around the concept of perpetual war, it was literal belief expressed in every neural pathway and every conditioning protocol. The warp translation that took the Righteous Covenant did not kill the Terminator veterans in the deep stasis cells. What it did was something the chapter's chaplains would have considered, had any of them survived to consider it, a form of divine preservation. The same immaterial forces that unmade the rest of the crew left the deepest cells undisturbed, encased them in a warp imprinting that touched the gene seed of the suspended warriors without disrupting it, that infused the stasis matrices with a kind of immaterial permanence rather than consuming them. The veterans emerged from their translation not unaltered, but not dead. Not alive in any standard biological assessment of the term, but reactive, present, their metabolic functions suspended but not concluded, their neural activity reduced to the lowest sustainable threshold but not extinguished, and saturated at every level of their preserved neurochemistry with the warp's character. In practical terms, when the kill automata's activation pulse propagated through the vessel's electrical systems at hour 4 of the Tau expedition, it reached the sealed chambers of the Righteous Covenant section as a current. The stasis matrices received it. The veterans' neural activity, which had been operating at that barely sustained threshold for 3,000 years, registered it. And the conditioning that had been embedded into those neural architectures over 7 decades of continuous war and 7 subsequent centuries of immaterial infusion responded to it. They did not simply wake up. They resumed. There is no other word that does the accuracy service. They did not reorient to a new situation, did not assess unfamiliar circumstances, did not require the minutes of post-dormancy confusion that even a custodian like myself needed before full cognitive clarity returned. The neural state that had been suspended was the neural state that returned, unmodified, uncorrupted by the passage of 3,000 years, because for the warriors themselves no time had passed at all. They had been in the moment of battle. They returned to the moment of battle. The Righteous Covenant's final engagement, the purge operation in the Styx Nebula that had ended in their warp translation, was the reality their minds had last inhabited, and it was the reality they re-inhabited upon awakening. They were, in the most precise sense, still in that battle. And the biomass signatures of 43 living beings in the corridors above them, detected through the vessel's mechanical nervous system via the same protocols that had activated the kill automata, were interpreted through the lens of that uninterrupted combat state as enemy contact. I felt them moving through the Covenant's structure. Even at my position in the Iron Sepulchre, even through the passive network's limited resolution, there was a quality to the vibration of the deck that was unmistakable if you had felt it before. Terminator armor does not walk. It processes through space with the deliberate, massive weight of something that has never needed to consider whether the floor beneath it is rated for its occupancy. Each footfall of Indomitus pattern Terminator plate carries the kinetic signature of approximately 1,000 kilograms of ceramite and adamantium moving at combat speed, And when 12 sets of that armor are moving simultaneously through the same vessel, the effect on the surrounding structure is something between physical fact and spiritual experience. The Tau, at this moment, were still engaged with the kill automata. They had destroyed one. This was not a trivial achievement. Pulse blasters at concentrated close range, for fire warriors in overlapping fire with marker light designation from the Pathfinder element, had accumulated sufficient structural damage to the automaton's primary actuator systems to stop its engagement progression. It had taken 11 seconds of continuous fire and the coordinated commitment of a third of their combat element's firepower to stop a single non-sentient machine of pre-heresy Mechanicus provenance. In 11 seconds, the Tau formation had withdrawn 12 meters, lost one fire warrior to the automaton's initial engagement, and expended 15% of the assault configuration pulse blaster charges that their combat element had brought aboard. They had destroyed one automaton. There were 11 more. And the automata were not what was going to be the defining experience of the next 20 minutes. Shaso Kai's rear Pathfinder element detected the Terminator warriors via motion differential scan approximately 30 seconds before visual contact. I watched the Pathfinder team leader, VRE Kais, receive the data readout from her scan unit and go completely still for exactly 3 seconds before she communicated it to the commander. 3 seconds of absolute physical stillness, which I recognized as the physiological response of a tactically experienced soldier receiving information whose implications required rapid cognitive recalibration against assumptions so fundamental they had never been consciously articulated. She had never seen anything move that slow and that heavy and still be alive. She communicated the contact data to Shaso Kai in a voice that carried perfect professional control and no trace whatsoever of the fear that her posture expressed. He looked at the scan readout for 2 seconds. And then he made the only correct decision available. The only correct decision, when the combined threats are 12 kilautomata and 12 Terminator veterans of a Crusade chapter in a Space Hulk's transit corridors, is to move faster than you have moved at any point previously, abandoning everything that is not essential to the survival of the maximum number of personnel, and reach your exit point before the engagement geometry collapses entirely around you. Shaso Kai ordered exactly that. Combat withdrawal at maximum sustainable speed. Non-combat personnel moved to the formation's center core, fire warriors providing rearguard action in paired sacrifice elements while the main body extracted. Clean, decisive, professionally executed. The corridors did not cooperate. This is the fundamental operational reality of a Space Hulk that no planning protocol can fully account for. The interior geometry is not stable. Not in the gross physical sense of structural collapse, though that remains a permanent background possibility, but in the subtler sense of a space that has been warp-touched sufficiently long that its relationship with spatial consistency has become approximate rather than absolute. Corridors that were 4 meters wide on the inward transit were 3 meters wide on the withdrawal. The ceiling of the merchant section's primary access passage, which the Tau had noted as approximately 4 meters high on entry, now felt, not was, but felt lower, closer, more present. The lighting in sections that had been marginally functional on entry was now either absent entirely or functioning in spectra that the human retina would have processed as disorienting, and that the Tau perceptual system, not identical but not entirely dissimilar in its warp-adjacent vulnerabilities, was clearly finding actively unpleasant. I am not speaking of supernatural events here. I want to be precise about that. Nothing I am describing violates the physics of a reality shaped by immaterial forces rather than purely material ones. The corridors were not literally changing. What was changing was the vessel's environmental management systems, responding to the Covenant's deep resonance protocols by adjusting atmospheric composition, thermal gradients, electromagnetic field distributions, and lighting spectra in the precise combinations that 3,000 years of immaterial saturation had determined were most effective at degrading the functioning capacity of living biological systems operating under stress. The Covenant had learned, in the way machines learn through accumulated response conditioning rather than intentional programming, what made living things fail. It was applying that knowledge. The rear guard element of the Tau formation met the Terminator vanguard in the transitional corridor. I saw it through the passive network in the limited resolution available to me, and even through that resolution's considerable constraints, I understood immediately why VRE Kais had gone still for 3 seconds. The Terminator warriors were not moving with the mechanical precision of the automata. They were moving with something that combined the automata's physical weight with the something other quality of consciousness that has been suspended at the crisis point of its highest expression and resumed without the intervening years of normalcy that would have moderated it. They moved with absolute certainty. Not the certainty of programming, the certainty of faith. 3,000 years had passed in the galaxy and zero time had passed in their operational state, and the operational state they had returned to was that of warriors who had not yet been killed and who had never seriously considered that they might be. The Tau rear guard fired the moment they had targeting solution. They were correct to do so. For fire warriors, 2 pathfinders with marker light designation sustained pulse blaster fire at a range of approximately 20 meters in a corridor 4 meters wide. An extraordinary concentration of close-range anti-armor fire from soldiers who had drilled for corridor combat and who maintained their formation discipline under conditions that would have broken many more experienced units. The Terminator Vanguard walked through it. This is not exaggeration. This is the physics of Indomitus pattern Terminator plate, which was designed to be worn by the most elite warriors of the Legions Astartes in exactly these environments: tight corridors, concentrated fire, overwhelming close-range threat, and whose protective capacity against standard infantry weapons, even the impressive antimaterial specifications of the Tau Firecast's pulse blasters, represents a discontinuity rather than a gradient. The armor was not unaffected. The fire was not meaningless. But the effect-to-damage ratio required to stop a Terminator veteran through concentrated small arms fire at those range parameters was not achievable with what the rear guard had available, and the warriors closed the distance before that mathematical reality could be overcome. 2 fire warriors of the rear guard were lost in the engagement's first 15 seconds. The remaining 2 withdrew, firing as they moved, maintaining fire discipline even as they fell back into the merchant section corridor where Shaso Kai had positioned the second covering element. The Pathfinders moved with them, continuing to designate through their marker lights even as the engagement context had moved beyond any scenario their marker light doctrine had been designed to address. They continued to function. They continued to contribute. They were exceptional soldiers in a situation that had exceeded the parameters within which their exceptional soldiering could produce favorable outcomes. The Terminator warriors did not pursue with urgency. They did not need to. They moved at the pace of things that have never been stopped, filling the corridor with their presence the way weight fills water. Gradually, completely, without accommodation for what might prefer not to be displaced. Their storm bolters fired in disciplined bursts rather than panic spray, acquiring targets with the methodical attention of warriors whose enhanced perceptual systems were designed for exactly this environment, who could see in spectra that rendered the Covenant's degraded lighting irrelevant, who had no psychic vulnerability to the atmospheric and electromagnetic manipulations the vessel was deploying against the Tau. The Covenant's active interference, which was costing the Tau formation between 10 and 15% of their operational efficiency, meant nothing to Ceramite and Gene Seed. Shaso Kai was now running the calculation that every military commander dreads. How many must be sacrificed to preserve the remainder? I had been running the same calculation since the first automaton emerged. We reached the same answer at approximately the same moment. Shaso Kai made his decision at the approach corridor to the entry breach point, and I will state plainly that the decision was correct. He took the 4 remaining fire warriors of the rear guard, supplemented by 2 of the more physically capable Pathfinders, and formed a final blocking element at the corridor's last major junction, a 6-sided Mechanicus design intersection that offered the maximum available field of fire from its multiple approach angles while simultaneously providing the compression geometry that would force the Terminator warriors into sequential rather than parallel approach. He positioned his blocking element there. He directed the remaining personnel VRE Chasoras and her Earthcast team, the diplomat Poraviari, the surviving 4 Pathfinders, and 3 fire warriors who had been carrying the heaviest equipment burdens and were therefore least suited for the blocking role, to move with maximum speed toward the breach point and the waiting extraction craft. He remained with the blocking element himself. I want you to understand the significance of that choice within the context of Tau Firecast doctrine. The Shaso rank is not merely a rank designation. It is a statement of institutional investment. Each O-rank officer represents decades of accumulated combat experience, command training, and strategic development that the Firecast cannot rapidly replace. The doctrine of the greater good explicitly addresses the preservation of command elements in situations of tactical failure, The welfare of the mission and the information it carries is considered superior in value to the individual lives even of senior officers. Shaso Kai knew this. He had served the greater good for long enough to have internalized that calculation completely. He made the other choice. I found this more affecting than I had anticipated. It is strange, perhaps, for a being of my tenure and training to be affected by the conduct of a Xenos soldier in the service of a philosophy that stands against the Imperium's existence. I have spent 10,000 years conditioning myself against the particular vulnerability of admiration for enemies. But a space Hulk has a clarifying effect on values. When the only truth present is the fundamental one, the willingness to remain, knowing the cost, to buy time for others with the one currency that cannot be replenished, the institutional affiliations that normally define allegiance become less definitional. He was a good soldier, a good commander, in a different galaxy, a galaxy that the Tau, in their optimistic sophistication, occasionally seemed to believe they might build. He would have been worth preserving. The Covenant did not traffic in different galaxies. The blocking element held the junction for 9 minutes and 40 seconds. I tracked this precisely through the passive network, watching the engagement geometry from my position in the Iron Sepulchre with the compound attention of someone who could not intervene and refused to look away. The pulse blasters at their maximum rate of fire, coordinated with marker light designation, in a position engineered to maximize their angular coverage. This was the Firecast's doctrine performing at its designed apex. In an open field engagement at these range parameters against these numbers, the outcome would have been different. In a corridor, against targets that the range advantage had been designed to overcome, against targets that could not be stopped by the accumulated fire available to the element before they closed to engagement range, against targets that were not frightened and did not tire and whose training had been perfected in exactly this environment. 9 minutes and 40 seconds. It was, I will say, longer than I would have calculated. The survivors reached the breach point in 7 minutes. 7 of the 12 non-combat personnel, 3 Earthcast analysts, the diplomat Poraviari, and 3 Pathfinders, made it through the breach into the extraction airlock before the kill automata, moving through the subfloor conduits that had been tracking the formation's movement throughout, surfaced at the loading bay. The final engagement at the breach point was brutal in the specific way that close-range engagements between fire-optimized infantry and machines that do not register fire as a deterrent are always brutal, quickly decided, desperately contested, ultimately unequal. The 3 remaining Pathfinders formed the final covering element. One automaton was stopped at the breach threshold by concentrated fire, its leg actuators destroyed, its chassis toppled into the aperture, physically blocking the passage for 30 seconds while the survivors completed extraction. 30 seconds purchased at the cost of a Pathfinder who maintained direct fire from 4 meters and did not survive the automaton's final responsive action. 6 survivors reached the extraction craft. The seals closed. In the corridor behind the breach, the Terminator warriors reached the loading bay 60 seconds after the extraction craft's separation from the hull. They had not been rushing. They did not rush. The Covenant's patience was theirs now, absorbed through 3,000 years of shared dormancy. The kill automata sealed the breach point from the inside. Darkness returned to the loading bay. The Terminator warriors stood in it for a time, the passive network registering the electromagnetic signatures of their presence, before they turned with the deliberate gravity of their full weight and began the long walk back toward the sealed chambers of the Righteous Covenant section. They returned to dormancy one by one over the course of the following day, the ship's automated systems receiving their mechanical returns and cycling down their activation sequences with the unhurried completeness of protocols designed for indefinite repetition. The Covenant drifted on. I stood in the Iron Sepulchre and listened to the returning silence. It tasted of iron and old grief and the particular completeness of a lesson fully administered. I filed a report with the channels I had been provided for exactly this purpose. Encrypted narrow beam directed at a receiver address in the Segmentum Tempestus that I hoped still existed, that I had no way to confirm was still staffed, but that the sealed orders required me to use regardless. I described the events in precise operational language. I listed the casualties. I described the performance of the Tau blocking element at the junction with the particular clarity I felt was appropriate to honest documentation. I noted that the extraction vessel had departed with 6 survivors and the data archives of the Earthcast research team, which had transmitted their collected readings to the parent vessel's cogitator cores via continuous compression uplink throughout the expedition. meaning that everything Vrichasaurus and her team had documented in the Covenant's outer sections was now in Tau possession, available for analysis by a civilization with the intellectual thoroughness to make significant use of. This was not a trivial observation. The Tau, unlike some of the species the Imperium has encountered in its long and exhausting history of existential conflict, do not discard data. They do not file reports in bureaucratic vaults where they will slowly calcify under the weight of institutional accumulation. They process information. They think collectively about it. They build new doctrine from it. The 6 survivors and their data archive would generate, in the Kelshan September's military and scientific institutions, a body of analysis regarding space Hulk threat profiles that would influence Tau operational doctrine for generations. They would not re-enter a space Hulk with 60 soldiers and optimism. The next time the Tau considered boarding a space Hulk, they would bring something different. Whether something different would be sufficient is a question I leave to minds less burdened with foreknowledge than mine. I want to speak now about what I experienced in the hours after the survivors departed, because I think it is the most honest part of what I have to tell, and because I suspect it will surprise those who have formed a particular expectation of a custodian's interiority based on the institutional reputation we carry. We are not unfeeling instruments. We were not made to be. The Emperor designed us as expressions of the totality of human potential, not as weapons shaped from everything human except the capacity for reflection, and reflection, in the aftermath of what I had watched, was unavoidable. I thought about Shaso Kai. I thought about the 3 seconds in which Vri Kais had stood still before reporting the Terminator contact, and what those 3 seconds represented about the capacity of a living mind to encounter the genuinely incomprehensible and still choose function over paralysis. I thought about the diplomat Paraviari moving through the Covenant's outer corridors with the careful self-possession of a being whose entire training is in the management of communication and relationship, finding herself in a space that communicated nothing except ancient, patient hostility, and maintaining the composure that her caste demanded of her. I thought about the Earth caste researcher pressing her hand to the sealed equipment bay lock and the quiet scientific delight she had displayed before the low harmonic had traveled up through her feet and changed the character of her curiosity into something darker. I thought about what the greater good must mean to a civilization that genuinely believes it. Not as rhetoric. Not as institutional justification for conquest dressed in philosophical language, which is the form that most imperial ideologies take when they achieve sufficient confidence in their own permanence. As actual belief. The Tau believe, with a sincerity I have observed in their history, their cultural products, their diplomatic conduct, and their willingness to incorporate genuinely alien species into their social structures on terms of meaningful if imperfect equality, that the universe can be made better through cooperative effort. That sapient life, in aggregate, can organize itself toward outcomes that are good rather than merely survivable. That there is a direction that progress can take which does not ultimately terminate in darkness. The galaxy we actually inhabit has been attempting to disabuse beings of that belief since the first star ignited, and it has not yet finished the project. I found myself, in the iron silence of the Covenant, unable to form a clear conviction about whether I wanted the Tau to be right. This is not a thought I would commit to an official report. Official reports are not the appropriate venue for a shield captain's uncertainties. But I am not filing an official report now. I am telling you what happened, and what happened includes the consciousness of the person observing it, and my consciousness on that day in the aftermath of that expedition contained something that I had long experience identifying in others and considerably less practice finding in myself. Something that resembled hope. Not hope for any particular outcome. Not the institutional hope of the Imperium, which has calcified over 10,000 years into a form more closely resembling desperate denial than genuine expectation. Something more cautious than that, and more honest. The recognition that the universe, even this one, still contains things capable of choosing the harder action when the easier one is available. Still contains beings willing to remain at a junction when the cost of remaining has been clearly established, for the sake of others they are responsible for. Still contains scientists who extend their hands toward sealed doors because curiosity about what the universe contains is stronger than caution about what it might do to them. These are not small things in a galaxy of the scale and darkness of ours. They are not sufficient things. I do not claim they are sufficient. The Covenant is still drifting. The Terminator warriors are still in their sealed chambers, waiting for the next activation pulse. The kilautomata are still moving through their subfloor conduits, their machine spirits still calibrated to their single lethal purpose. The galaxy is still producing space hulks at the rate that 3 millennia of intermittent warp activity can be relied upon to sustain. But 6 of them survived. 6 beings who had entered a drifting tomb of iron and old death, who had confronted things that their species had no precedent for and no doctrine adequate to, who had experienced the particular variety of total disorientation that comes from discovering that the universe contains categories of threat that your entire civilization's accumulated wisdom has no response to. 6 of them had gotten out. Not by victory, not by conquest or technological superiority or the application of force sufficient to overcome the threat. By choosing, quickly and correctly, that survival is not defeat, that withdrawal is not the same as surrender, that the information you carry out of an impossible situation has more value than the pride of remaining in it. They had learned the lesson the Covenant was built to teach. Whether they would be permitted to apply, it was not a question I could answer from the Iron Sepulchre. I sealed my report. I returned to my casket. I initiated the dormancy cycle, which accepted me with the unhurried familiarity of a thing I had done too many times to count. The silence returned. The stars continued their long burning. And somewhere in the dark, 6 survivors were already writing down what they had seen,